Well, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nate Schutta. I'm based out of the States. I wish I was in Europe right now. It's been so long since I've been across the pond. I miss it quite a bit. Thought about that actually quite a bit over the last few months. I'm looking forward to getting back on airplanes, although maybe not quite as much as I used to. So let's talk a bit about this whole CI/CD thing, shall we? Now, it used to be fairly simple. I remember back at the beginning of my career, you had a monolith, maybe two. You released versions semi-annually, some version of quarterly releases, et cetera. We all worked on the same floor, or at least within walking distance of one another. But let's be clear, that's just not the world we live in today, is it? No, we have dozens, hundreds, thousands of services. New versions are dropping every day. Your team is scattered all around the globe. And of course, the reality is building apps has never been easy. It's never been simple. But now we have these massively distributed applications with geographically dispersed teams, and we can't afford to just keep doing things the way we always have. It's clear to me that the most dangerous phrase that you can say in an organization these days is, "That's how we've always done it." I hear that a lot. And I understand that it's comforting. It's what we're used to. But that doesn't mean that's how we can continue to behave and expect to get the results that we want. Now, I don't think our industry does a particularly good job of studying its history. I think that's unfortunate. So I want to do a little bit of a level set of kind of how did we even get to where we are. Now, software development has been a very siloed experience, at least it was for a number of years. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with waterfall. You've probably lived through some waterfall in your career. And, I guess it sort of made sense and it worked for some variant of work, right? But one phase flows into another and never shall we return to the previous phase. And, so we go do a bunch of requirements gathering, and then we do some design, and then we go build it, and then we test it. And then it goes into the maintenance mode, where I was taught software spends most of its life in maintenance, which is another way of saying, well, they're products that we just continue to invest in. And again, that worked for some definition of worked. I guess it was the worst form of software except for all the other ones we tried. And of course, during this era of software, our teams were typically separated. They were very siloed, or we were all put in our little bento box. We had the BAs, and they went out and did their thing. And then we wrote some code, and there was a little dash of UI put on to make it look good. And, the operators did their thing with the infrastructure, and then the testers did their thing. And to put it real bluntly, we didn't always work together particularly well. There was often animosity between groups. In many situations, it was borderline trench warfare between developers and testers, or, the BAs and developers. And a lot of times the handoff was one way. It was all one-way traffic. It was typically heavily scheduled, limited to just a few times a year, the traditional quarterly release cycle. Or to put it another way, we're just going to throw it over the wall to ops. We're going to throw it over the wall to QA and just let them deal with it. It's not my problem anymore. And that was kind of the way we did it. Now, I saw this tweet. It made me laugh because it seems very emblematic of the way we've traditionally done this. So we're going to throw that feature over to QA instead of collaborating. So I'm trying to break this pane of glass. Well, that didn't work. Here, somebody throw a hammer on it. Boom, there we go. Very satisfying to see that thing shatter. And of course, during this era of software, there was a fair amount of finger pointing that went on. It was really common for us as developers to say to our QA brethren, "Oh, hey, works as designed," or my personal favorite, "unable to reproduce." And the infrastructure folks would get mad at us because, "Hey, you brought prod down again. What were you thinking?" And let's just put it politely, this was not an ideal way to work. For much of software, we frankly measured our cycle times in astronomical units. In other words, we moved really slowly, kind of like this turtle, although I guess if that was my morning commute, maybe I wouldn't be in much of a rush either. Now, unfortunately for us, the world doesn't stand still. We can't, again, sort of fall back on the "that's how we've always done it" mantra. Whether it's convenient or not, the business cycles that we're all subject to have sped up, and we have to adapt. We have to embrace that always be changing mindset. We need to turn code around in days or weeks, certainly not months or years. I think when I first got into software, the most common estimate was 18 months. Everything was 18 months. Didn't seem to really matter what you asked for. It's going to take 18 months. And I remember the first spring one that I attended as an employee, a gentleman from Scotiabank got up and sort of talked about their journey from their traditional quarterly releases to doing, releases all the time, thousands of releases in a month. And I remember talking to some of my former colleagues and they said, oh, Nate, we can't possibly do that. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, you worked with us for years, there's no way we can do that. And I said, well, I mean, friends, if Scotiabank can do it, and they're a bank, financial institutions tend to be really heavily regulated for good reasons, then anybody can do it, and we all have to be able to do it. Because the reality today, whether it's convenient or not, is speed matters and disruption is impacting every business. There isn't an industry out there that's immune to this. I think if you were a grocery store chain, maybe for a while, you could kind of ignore software and be like, that's for somebody else. We're not a startup. And then Amazon bought Whole Foods, and all of a sudden in the US, in some cities anyways, you can order your groceries directly from Whole Foods via Amazon Prime. And I spent a lot of my career in insurance and was certainly bantied about that maybe Google's really a competitor of ours because they're really good at managing information. That's kind of what an insurance company is ultimately doing. And whether it's convenient or not, we're all technology companies today. And I would say that's one of the biggest shifts I've seen. When I first got into software right out of university, the CIO at the company I was at gave a presentation to all of us, and he stressed repeatedly that this is not a technology company. We're here to support the business. And if what you want is to be at a technology company, well, you're not going to be happy here. So go find a new job and don't worry, there's plenty of them. You'll be fine. And I understood where he was coming from, quote unquote, we were a cost center. I mean, I did think it was a little weird when you looked at how large that cost center was compared to the rest of the company, but okay, fine. I take your phrasing. Now, transform, 20-ish years later, I was with a client and their CIO got up and had a completely different message for the developers there. He said, folks, we're a technology company that happens to be in retail. And that right there to me is emblematic of the shift that we've seen, embracing the reality that whether it's convenient or not, we are all technology companies today. So what do we do about that? Now, to be fair, if you ask a typical software engineer, how can we make this better? Well, the software engineer is going to say, if we want to improve something, let's make it look more like software engineering. This is sort of that literal embodiment of, I'm going to have more cowbell in order to make this work. So just give me more cowbell. So where did we begin this journey? Well, we looked around and said, hey, this testing thing's not quite working the way we'd hope. So you know what? Let's make testing more like software engineering. Let's automate it. And let's make developers responsible for writing a bunch of automated tests. Now, the beauty of that is it's going to free our testing professionals to do more interesting things to the application. They don't have to verify that this field only accepts letters or numbers or whatever it is. They can do the more interesting things, those more devious things that a human being can come up with. This tweet made me laugh. QA engineer walks into a bar and orders a beer and orders 0 beers, orders a whole lot of beers, orders a lizard, orders -1 beers, orders mash keyboard. And first real customer walks in and asks where the bathroom is, and the bar bursts into flames, killing everyone. It's like, yeah, that's pretty much software in a nutshell right there. And of course, that was, I think, pretty commonly accepted these days. As a developer, I have a bare minimum, a certain amount of testing that I'm required to do in order to say that this is complete, that I've met my requirements, and then letting, again, our QA engineers do more interesting things. But for a long time, we still kind of ignored production. And it was sort of like, LOL, that's not my job. That's not my problem. And besides, hey, it works on my box, so everything must be fine. So what did we do next? Well, again, we just would throw it over the wall and say, hey, that's the prod ops folks' deal. Let's let them deal with it. I don't care about production, not my problem. And I thought of this as a parent. I mean, think if that's how we did our job as parents. The kid hits a certain age, 5 or 7. It's like, all right, that's it. You're the world's problem now. Besides, it worked in my house, so everything's fine. Now, to be clear, this was a bit of animosity both directions, right? Because our operators are incented to keep production up and running. Availability matters a lot to them. And so they can look at us and be like, you developers just keep writing bugs that bring production down. Stop doing that. And so you can kind of make an argument that, if we just don't release, uptime is going to be 100%. That sounds great. So let's do that. Let's just not release ever. Now, obviously, we couldn't get away with that, but we'd make it really hard to release software and put all these gates in and all these review boards and things like that. And that, again, worked for some variable of worked, but it didn't really allow us to iterate with the speed we needed. It didn't allow us to be as responsive as we needed to our customers. And so what have we done? Well, bang that cowbell a bit more, and let's make operations look a lot more like software engineering. And this means different things in different organizations. I was actually on a panel yesterday. We were talking about sort of the cultural shift of DevOps and things like that. And it's clear that we're kind of taking on that first line of production support, and that we have some responsibility here that maybe we didn't in the past. And let's be honest, if you get paged at 3 a.m, it's probably going to incent you to write a little better software, a little more reliable software. And obviously I'm overly simplifying here, but if we are able to release more often, this is a really virtuous cycle, because now we get these nested feedback loops. Most importantly, I'm able to show my customers, hey, here's where we're going. Does this sound right? There's really nothing we do in life that isn't agile. It isn't this way. We're constantly making these little adjustments, whether it's, driving to the coffee shop or anything to that nature. We're always making little adjustments. We don't even really think about it half the time. And so that's a huge win for us, be able to show things to customers, get real feedback on this is what we're seeing. Is this what you were looking for? Oh, hey, now that you've seen this, maybe we'll go in this direction instead. But that's not the only feedback loop, because as we work more closely with our operators, well, that kind of incents us to reduce some of the friction. And our operators are able to kind of feed it back to us that, hey, if you did this, we could actually make the app more reliable, more fault tolerant, et cetera. The moral of the story here as well is that small batch isn't just for bourbon. It also makes for better software. It ultimately leads to less risk. This to me is one of the real ironies of quarterly releases. You jam thousands of changes into a big code base, there will be problems. That's almost a guarantee. 1 or 2 changes, it's a lot easier to spot those unintended side effects. The other beauty of this is it allows us to experiment. It allows us to try different things and see what happens if we do this versus that. And we can get real data back. And so instead of us just sort of guessing, well, I think this will increase sales or increase signups or increase conversions or whatever the metric is we care about, we can actually try it out and put 5% or 10% or 20% of our customers on one variant and see what happens and actually get real data back. That's huge for us. That's another really nice nested feedback loop. It also allows us to be much more responsive to business changes, and as new opportunities emerge or other things happen that we have to be responsive to, we can do that. We can embrace that instead of saying, well, you can have it in 6 to 18 months. Helps our velocity, which is always a win. We can get code turned around more quickly and ultimately leads to higher quality code in production, which is what we're striving to do. That's going to lead to better software. Now, the important thing from our customer's perspective is, hey, this means more business value, which is going to ultimately make happier customers. Now, I think the other big shift I've seen in software is that we're recognizing this is really a collaborative game, and that we all are aligned if we do this right. And it puts our accountabilities in the same place, as opposed to what we've traditionally done, which is we'll measure the developers on this metric, measure the props people on this metric, measure QA on this metric. At the end of the day, we should all be measured on how we doing on getting features and functionality to production. Are we actually getting that accomplished or not? And, the individual bits and pieces aren't nearly as important as well as a group. Are we getting more features and functionality to production more reliably, more repeatably, et cetera? Now, one of the ways we can do this is with error budgets. And so we can establish a target for availability. We may decide that we need 2 nines of availability. That means I have an error budget of 1%. Now, as a development team, I'm free to spend that budget basically however I want. I'm just not allowed to go over that limit. So we're not shooting for 0 outages, no downtime. It's just, let's stay within the error budget, whatever that happens to be. So experiment, try things out, do those different things that we want to figure out and try and experiment with. But once you've eaten up that budget, you're probably going to have to slow your roll a little bit, maybe delay something or be a little more cautious with our experiments. And ultimately, the advantage of this is it aligns our incentives with our production support folks, because now we all understand what the trade-offs are, and we can have a real conversation about sort of that cost benefit, as opposed to just pointing fingers at one another, which is what we've traditionally done. So again, rather than measuring our operators on uptime and developers on velocity, let's turn this into this collaborative game. We are responsible for delivering business value. And for whatever reason, this makes me think of one of the, quote unquote, great American novels, The Grapes of Wrath, which in my opinion really focuses on sort of that social metamorphosis from the I to the we. And that's really where I think we need to get with software, is let's put our focus and attention on how we get features to production as quickly as possible, as opposed to, again, pointing fingers at one another. So how do we do that? Well, this is where automation comes into play. Now, I am very much of the opinion that human beings just can't do the same thing twice. We should automate away as much as humanly possible. This is actually a conversation I had with my wife on more than one occasion. But back in the day, I very distinctly remember doing this one particular project where our build was the epitome of a Rube Goldberg machine. Almost everything in this process was manual. You'd right click on your IDE and export this, and then you copy that over to this magic drive location where there just happens to be some hard coded credentials, and don't tell anybody, but they were in clear text. And you know what? It worked for some definition of worked. And it's okay that it's kind of a chunky process because, well, we don't do it very often. We don't need to go to production more than a few times a year. And so it's okay that it's this weird manual process that has a lot of steps in it that sometimes go right and sometimes go wrong. Now, one of my great passions in life is coffee. I'm a big, big fan of coffee. And one of my team's superpowers is we will find the best coffee in whatever city we happen to be in. And I'm adamantly of the opinion that artisanal coffee is totally worth seeking out. I love it. I don't want that with my builds, though. And bespoke builds just do not get the job done today. I don't care what anybody says. It's just not the right way to work. Again, human beings cannot do the same thing twice. If you don't believe me, take up golf as a hobby and let's come back and chat. Because if you really, truly think you can do it that way, it's just not how the game works. And let's be honest, people have bad days. They get bored. They skip a step. They wipe out a DNS entry, taking down all of your company's properties and, including your ability to even badge into the server room. Oops. We fat finger a command. I'm sure some of you may have seen this email, or at least saw tweets about this email. HBO sent out to a bunch of subscribers, integration test email number 1. This template is used by integration tests only. Oops. And I love Emily's response. Hey, we got you. Could have been any of us. Take a deep breath. It's going to be fine. Mistakes happen. That's just the reality. I wasn't overly surprised. Well, I was surprised that the DNS outage took down their abilities to get into their rooms there at Facebook, but such is life. We'll all learn from that experience, I hope. Here's the beauty of computers. Computers don't ever fat finger a command. Computers don't ever get bored. They don't ever skip a step. They just do the same thing you told them to do again and again and again. They're actually really good at that. They like doing that. I learned a long time ago that in computer science, there's really only 3 numbers. There's something we do 0 times. There's something we do once and only once. And then there's N. If you do something more than once, you might as well automate it because you're going to do it a billion times. So anything that you do more than once, find a way to automate that away. And so the goal here is to offload as much of that toil to the computer as we possibly can. Let the computer do what it's good at. Let the humans do what they're good at. I love this tweet from Venkat. He's got a lot of great tweets. Do manually only things that truly give intellectual pleasure. Automate the rest of the work away. Totally agree with this. Now, the reality with us when it comes to software is I need consistency. I need reliability. I need repeatability. I need CI and CD pipelines to get my code to production, again, in a reliable, repeatable manner. Now, we've written a lot about this. It's certainly one of my little, wheelhouse areas, if you will. We're not the only ones. The GitHub folks have a lot of good information out here as well. And it's important to understand that this doesn't require you to say, well, my commits go to production 30 seconds later. They could, but no one starts there. And I would argue there's very few organizations that are truly going to that level of you commit and it automatically goes to production. Again, after passing a whole bunch of tests and gates and whatnot, but it's an option. So we start with CI, continuous integration. This has been around for, I think, almost my entire career at this point. We're pretty darn close. And this just basically says merge conflicts are painful. So let's avoid merge conflicts by merging early and merging often. Because we just don't want to get involved in merge HE double hockey stick. And what happens when you commit code? Well, it triggers a set of tests to run, maybe some code quality scans, other things of that nature, whatever matters to you, to give you some confidence that when someone commits new code, they haven't broken the application in some way, shape, or form. Now, from there, we sort of evolved now into CD, continuous delivery, which says, well, let's take that build to the next step. how do we release that into production? How do we release that in such a place where our customers can access it? So in other words, carrying that automation through to sort of the deployment and release management aspects of software. Now, again, this could be, if everything passes, it goes straight to production, although that's, again, fairly rare. It's up to you how often you actually release. Now, not just you, obviously, your team, your customer, et cetera. It is, again, a collaborative effort, and different people are going to have different risk tolerances here. So there's going to be some negotiation, some discussion. Our goal ultimately is be in a releasable state. And again, we get there by doing small batch software, which ultimately does lower the risk here. Again, I've been a part of a lot of these quarterly release cycles, and it's amazing to me how we thought that batching up hundreds or thousands of changes with almost limitless interactions that become really difficult to reason about, it leads to breaks. I mean, no one could have predicted this. And then, of course, you get locked in that windowless conference room, usually over the weekend, very early in the morning when you'd rather be sleeping or literally doing almost anything else. And you're looking through this stack trace and these error messages, and you're trying to figure out, like, what caused the break? And the only answer we could give is, I have no idea, because it probably wasn't one or two or three changes. It was some interesting combination of these 7 seemingly unrelated changes that all grouped together caused this problem. Now, if I push 1 or 2 changes, well, it's a heck of a lot easier to understand what went wrong. It was probably one of these 2 changes, one would think. I, for one, am kind of fascinated to see what comes out of, sort of the after action report here from Facebook. The other piece of this that we have to understand is the only way we get better at something is repetition. Period. Full stop. Nobody gets good at something by doing it once or twice. So if you only do a push to production a few times a year, it's really hard to get good at it because you just don't have the reps. This is a conversation I had with my son repeatedly. Like, if you want to get good at a sport or frankly anything, you have to do it again and again and again and again and again. And so the mantra that I try to preach in organizations is we need to deploy early and deploy often. Because if we're deploying multiple times a week, you will be incented to buff off the rough edges, get rid of the friction, and you will get better at it, period. It also means you start to trust the process, because we've done it again and again and again and again. It's reliable. We know how it works. We know what's coming out the other end of it. The other thing this gives us ultimately is recoverability. I've been a part of these very heavyweight software development life cycles, and it's sort of like, let's pour concrete all over the problem to make sure that there's no outages and no problems. And the reality is we just can't do that. I'm quite confident Facebook didn't set out on Monday. Some engineer wasn't like, hey, I'm going to wipe out a DNS entry because I think that'd be a fun way to spend my Monday. I know that was unintentional. I assume it was unintentional. So things are going to happen. The challenge is, well, how do we recover from that? So we know mistakes are going to happen. We know outages are going to happen. Some bug will find its way into the code base, or again, some interaction of 2 or 3 things that we didn't consider will be the problem. And so we need to focus on that mean time to recovery. This is really what we're trying to do. How quickly can we fix a problem when it happens? So how do we do that? Well, again, it's automation. It's knowing that I can basically push a button, I can turn the crank, and this problem will go away. And that's what gives us confidence. That's what gives us the ability to try things, experiment, and see what happens. Think about your editor, your word processor, any tool you use has undo in it somewhere. I mean, can you imagine what life would be like if you didn't have undo? I'm old enough to have used a manual typewriter at one point, and it was really painful when you had a typo or you misspelled something and you'd have to use this little weird white paper and tank over it and write again, or, oh, I guess I have to throw this all away. It was really painful. Now think about how we do it today. It's so automated, our stuff just fixes itself. In fact, my son ran into this with a Spanish assignment. The Google Docs thing auto-corrected one of the words, and when it auto-corrected that, it auto-corrected another word, and the instructor's like, wow, how did you know that verb tense? We haven't taught you that yet. It's like, well, Google knows about it, so who knew, right? It just corrected itself. Imagine if we didn't have the ability to do that. Think about writing software without version control. We used to do this, believe it or not, at some point in software development history. And I actually knew some people who wrote software without using version control. And they're like, oh yeah, I just put it on the LAN and I copy the folder and I, ran away. I'm like, oh God, this gives me nightmares. But we need that. We need these robust pipelines, and there's so many great options out there. It's whatever you like. Most of these are cloud-based these days, and it's really interesting to see how more and more of these sort of features are getting baked right into our tools. So GitHub Actions has baked a lot of this right into source code management of choice. We use this for our developer portal in a lot of ways. A lot of cool stuff can be done here. It's also important to understand that our deployment strategies are evolving as well. So if we go back in time, we only had one option back in the beginning, and that was nuke and pave. And so what we were doing was take the old version and just overlay it with the new version, and there was no way to roll back. You just, cross your fingers, hope for the best. It'll probably work out. Well, let's be honest, probably won't, but can't really say that to the customer. They don't like hearing that. And so inevitably, this high risk, just blow away the old code, almost always resulted in issues and breaks and bugs and sleepless nights. And this is back in the era when we'd say, okay, we got a fix coming up, so we're going to be down for 48 hours, and you'd navigate to the site, and it would be like the application will be down for maintenance. The reality is we can't get away with that today. Our customers' expectations have changed. One of my colleagues actually tweeted this out earlier this summer. I can't remember exactly what the company was, but she ran into one of these down for maintenance things, and my response was, deployment strategies are not evenly distributed. Here's the reality. If your site is down, your customers will find someone whose site is up. This is actually kind of what already started to happen yesterday. I saw something this morning that said a whole bunch of people downloaded Signal and a couple other apps once they realized the Facebook variants were down. And so it's kind of interesting to see how we route around some of these problems. But it's a reality, again, whether convenient or not, that we can't afford to be down for hours and hours and hours and hours for maintenance. Our customers just won't accept that anymore. The expectation, the proverbial Overton window has shifted, and we need to shift along with that. Now, this has ultimately evolved to this recreate pattern, which is let's spin down the current version and then spin up the new version. And that's good. It's simple, but it does mean I have longer downtimes because I'm taking one part offline, bringing a new part online. That could take, minutes, maybe an hour or two. So that's not great, Dan. And so that evolved into rolling updates, which is, all right, some subset of instances, normally referred to as the window size, are going to be updated at a time, which is great because, hey, look, no downtime now. But it also means that not everybody's getting the version at the same time. And, maybe some people are on the old version, some people are on the new version. Databases become a bit of a pain here. It's a little harder to roll back as well. Got to make sure we're backwards compatible. And it also kind of means I better have that sticky affinity thing turned on, understand session management, because it'd be probably a bummer if, one request went to one server that had the old version, then the next request went to the new version on a different server. It might be a problem. Now that evolved into blue-green deploys. This has been around a long time. This comes right out of the continuous delivery book. Martin wrote about this a decade plus ago. Continuous delivery books, I don't know, a decade old, decade and a half, I'm not entirely sure. The moral of the story is we have two identical deployment environments, and one is currently serving production traffic. Let's call that blue. It doesn't really matter. Call it whatever color you want. And we're doing our stress testing on the other version. Let's call it green. And then once everybody says, yeah, green looks good, thumbs up, we're ready to switch, we'll update the routing table. And now we point production at green, and then we turn blue into idle. Now, if it turns out that we missed something in testing, or there was something we didn't see until we got a certain amount of traffic, no problem. We just switch the routing table back, and we're right back to where we were before, and life is good. Okay. Now, if everything checks out, no worries. Blue is now our staging environment, and we just keep, ping-ponging until we run out of, the heat death of the universe. This also, by the way, rather handily tests our disaster recovery on every single deploy, which is pretty huge, to be honest with you. A lot of companies, we sort of like wink, wink, nod, nod at the whole disaster recovery thing. And then a disaster happens and we're like, uh-oh, hope everything comes back online. We also work, right? Probably. Now, databases are often our sticking point in a lot of these scenarios, which does mean we need to kind of separate those schema changes from application changes potentially. But again, gives us zero downtime and does give us a simpler rollback option, which ultimately reduces our risk. Sweet. Can be a bit more expensive because I am essentially running two full versions of prod, although arguably it's worth it for the advantages it gives us. Also has nice backwards compatibility, which is cool. there potentially can be an issue, and we have to think about how we're draining down those transactions before we do the cutover. Now, some people will say, well, we don't do blue-green, we do red-black. Isn't that totally different? I don't think so. I think they're basically the same thing, just different branding ultimately. And I do think it's really a branding issue. You can make a bit of a nitpick argument that blue-green could have both versions serving traffic, whereas red-black only one version serves traffic. So does that mean red-black is a specialization of blue-green? You know, your argument here is as valid as any, right? This reminds me, frankly, of one of my all-time favorite tweets. This is my old boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who wants to argue about the definitions of made-up words with me. That's kind of what we're doing in this debate. I would argue ultimately same concepts, different names, use whatever makes you happy. Blue gold is great, you know, green gold, or, you know, whatever colors you like is perfectly fine. Now, another option or refinement on this would be Canary Releases. And so what we're doing here is, yep, everything looks good in staging. We're going to go to Canary. So we're going to put real traffic on this, as in, you know, canary in the coal mine, but we're not going to put everybody on it all at once. So we want to make sure we find out an issue before we just unleash the floodgates of 100% of our traffic. So some percentage of production, 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever makes us happy. And that could be a sliding scale. This could move up over time, you know, maybe every 2 hours or every half day or whatever we care about, we bump it up a little further. But it's important to understand that canaries are serving real production traffic here. You know, this isn't simulated traffic. These aren't synthetic transactions. This is real customers hitting your servers. And if we find an error again, we just roll back to where we were before. And now we can live in Canary basically as long as we want. It could be hours, could be days. Again, this is totally up to you. I learned a long time ago that there's 3 answers to every question you've ever gotten asked in computer science. You know, there's 42. That's to see who is well read. There's another layer of indirection. That's one of my favorite phrases as an architect. But the answer I have to give more often than not, in fact, I really should just have a t-shirt printed up that says this, but it depends. You know, it depends is really the answer to almost every question we run into. Now, I'll admit some people get very upset when I say it depends. And I want to stress, I don't mean it as the end of the conversation. I mean it as the beginning of the conversation. And so if someone like me says to you, it depends, it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, what does it depend on, Nate? And then we have a conversation about that, because there's all sorts of interesting questions that we need to figure out before I can really give you a good answer. The moral of the story is this allows us to test real production scenarios without impacting everybody. Now, again, zero downtime, very easy rollback, but you better have your observability story straight. And this can also be kind of time consuming. You know, we could potentially be there for days, maybe even a couple of weeks. It just depends on really the risk of that change. And again, we always have to think about backwards compatibility. We need to think about sticky affinity, session management, etc. Now, another variant or refinement of these is A/B testing, and this is an extremely common thing. Now, this used to kind of be the purview of the tech companies, and there's been some interesting variations on this. You know, I've seen some cases where applications will show you a different price depending on where you are. You know, if you're near one of their bricks and mortar store, all of a sudden the price goes up because they think you have more of an intent to buy. Whereas when you're sitting in your living room, the price is lower because they're trying to entice you to make the purchase. You know, so there are some things here that maybe are a little goofy, but where it's fascinating for us is instead of guessing how our customers are going to react to a given change, will this increase conversions or increase signups or increase sales? Well, let's test it. You know, let's get data back. And so in these scenarios, we've got 2 or more potentially variations of a service running at a time. And these are experiments. And so this is our opportunity to test out these ideas we have, get real data to make better decisions. You know, so some percentage of users get the experiment, and it allows us to compare and contrast. Now, companies that do this at scale are doing it constantly. You know, the Twitters, the Googles of the world are doing this all the time. And so it is actually a technique we can employ. Although, again, as you can probably guess, better have your observability story straight. And yes, it's entirely possible to break your application. Now, it should be obvious that you can combine these techniques in various ways, shapes, and forms. You know, you could have a rolling blue-green, you could do canary blue-green, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that, of course, leads to the $1,000,000 question of like, well, what's the right approach for you? What should you do? There's only one answer to that. it depends. The moral of the story is you need to do what's right for you, for your situation, for the scenario you're in, and just understand that different apps are going to have different needs. Whatever your approach, it is vital that you automate and then automate some more and then automate even more. Now, if you're struggling to get people to kind of convince yourself that, we don't need to spend all this time and effort on automating deploys, blah, 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 who cares? Well, you might want to drop the reports from the SEC here in the US about the night capital glitch. All right, this was one of those scenarios where a software glitch basically took a company down. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. And so basically what they had is a zombie software that took this company out of business. And so what had happened is the developers repurposed an old flag, and then they proceeded to do a rolling deployment, except an operator missed one of the servers. So 7 servers had the new code, 1 didn't. Turns out this is not, in fact, fine. Night Capital lost close to $500 million, 75% of their market value, and they were acquired a week later. And that was basically sorry, feel bad for you. We're going to take you out of your misery. The lesson here at the end of the day is we can't afford to be the next Night Capital. Releases need to be reliable and they need to be repeatable. And we need to make sure that we're not relying on human beings to do everything perfectly, because that's just not how human beings work. That's not how we operate. So automation is your friend. Automation is what will help you get a good night's sleep. And this is ultimately just another example of shift left. And so basically the moral of the story is, let's find issues when they're easier to fix. As much as we may wish we could, once the cake comes out of the oven, it's really hard to change the recipe later and say, oh, I wish we'd made a chocolate cake instead. Well, too late, it's baked. Now, if you're not sure how to create a pipeline, don't worry, there's lots of data out there. My colleagues on the Spring team have the Spring Cloud Pipelines project, which is just an opinionated build, test, stage, prod, flow. It's just a place to start, modify it to your heart's content. And I would argue this is also just an example of that everything as code these days, which I guess I maybe almost say is anything we can put in version control seems to be kind of our modus operandi. And so you see this with lots of things, infrastructure as code, configuration as code, et cetera. And so what we're seeing here is we're knocking down these walls and we're building bridges between these different disparate groups. And as part of that, infrastructure has made this move in kind of that self-service model in at least some organizations, where instead of I as a developer having to fill out lots of tickets and go to lots of meetings and wait months and months and months to get a server, I can usually go to a website or something similar and go click, click, click. And, in many cases, seconds or minutes later, I have a server instance spun up, which is great when it comes to responsiveness. I think back to the beginning of my career, and boy, I had to make a lot of decisions really early in the process when I typically knew the least about what my project needed. So what was a really typical question that we would get? Well, how much capacity do you think you're going to need for this project? And I apparently have overused this slide in this deck, but I don't really know. I can make some educated guesses, but I was incented to sort of take my worst case, double it, add in some buffer, maybe double it again, just in case. Because the reality in most organizations that I was a part of, at least, is when I would ask for a server, there would be this rather lengthy lead time, which was really months. And it was lots of tickets for me to fill out. I'm convinced that in most organizations, the enterprise ticketing system is nothing more than a game you cannot win. And if you somehow do sneak a ticket through to the right person that alerts the administrator, and that person goes in and tweaks the rules so you can never do that again. And I think in my previous life, the most common way to actually get a ticket to work is I'd find somebody who somehow magically got the ticket in, and I would copy theirs and put in my information. Or even better, you knew someone that was part of the process, and you'd be like, hey, Mike, how do I do this? And he'd be like, no problem, I'll take care of it. And then it would magically work. It also meant you had to go to a lot of meetings and write a lot of email and do some follow-up and track people down. And it was enough to make you grumpy enough to flip a table. As a total aside, and I say this because she's in the other room, my wife saw this slide one day and she looked at me and she said, what is that? And I said, well, it's table flip. She said, what do you mean? I said, see, arms in the air, table flipped over, it's table flip. And she just kind of shook her head and walked out of the room and said, you have a very weird job. I said, you're not wrong. So during this era of software, it was in my best interest to heavily over allocate my resources. This was a prime example of better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Because if it turns out you needed more capacity later, ooh, ouch, that's going to take a long time. That's going to be really hard to do. And while I may not have cared from a doesn't really affect my bottom line, it's maybe some internal funny money kind of thing, it did lead us to having, in many cases, single digit resource utilization. So we had all these computers sitting around that were idle most of the time. And of course, that's starting to get flipped on its head by cloud computing, because now I have this ability to scale up and scale down and do that all on demand. And I technically have limitless compute with one really big caveat, which is additional fees may apply. And I don't think this is always obvious to some folks. I had a friend of mine who, well, someone on her team was playing around with a function and they forgot to turn it off and they let it run for a month. And at the end of the month, they had a $100,000 bill on their cloud, bill from just that function. And so needless to say, it's kind of an uncomfortable conversation with the management about that one. It's also obvious that these fees can be a bit opaque. There's a lot of great tweets I've seen about that. This is one of my favorites. I've been paying Amazon 80 cents a month. I went through and spent an hour searching the console and I thought I turned everything off. And then I got a bill for 23 cents. It's like, this thing's a Hotel California, can't get out. I love this one too. I took a look at AWS's simple cost calculator and I just want to know like how many instances of EC2 does it take to run the browser that's designed for the complex calculator. And so just for fun, I went and poked around and sure enough, there's a lot of stuff here. And this has always been there. It just wasn't as obvious to us as developers or architects. This was something that our infrastructure folks handled. And, they usually, at least in the companies I've worked at, they would have kind of some pre-formed ideas on a server. This is a small, a medium, a large, an extra large, and you'd kind of tell them what you needed and they would sort of fill in this information for you. And I didn't have to worry about it. Well, with cloud computing, this ultimately led to this sort of democratization of infrastructure, which means now I'm responsible for a lot of these things. And I may not completely understand the impact of turning something on, or might there be a more cost-effective way of doing this? And so it's very easy to turn something on and then forget about it. This is like a lot of subscription things these days. I actually was listening to a podcast where one of the advertisements was a service that helps you unsubscribe to things you've subscribed to without realizing it. And a lot of them are very clever of, oh, you just renewed. Well, it's too late for me to do anything about it. It'd be nice if you would tell me, a week before or a couple of days before, so I could maybe decide not to renew that. So I love this tweet. We dropped our cloud cost by 61% by simply looking at the bill and turning off things we weren't using. It's very easy to kind of not realize you've turned some of these things on. So don't be afraid to look at the bill and say, oh yeah, we don't really need that. Now, again, as a developer, I could largely ignore these issues in the past. It was up to my operators to solve that problem for me, but that's not the world we live in. Today, I really do have this paradox of choice, which if you're not familiar with, there's actually a TEDx video from Barry Schwartz who kind of coined this phrase. And that is such Professor Chic in his outfit there. I love that. But he talks about how actually having more choices actually can really be paralyzing, that you start to beach ball because like, oh, I could do so many things. The moral of the story for us is that democratization demands more of all of us, or to paraphrase the founding fathers of my country, well, a well-informed developer is a prerequisite to successful cloud. That also kind of brings us to this interesting question of, what do we want our developers focused on? This is actually something we talked about yesterday in this panel I was on, that, if we're not careful, we run into this scenario where my developers have an awful lot on their plate. And this actually was one of my colleagues said, with the approach a lot of companies are taking, your developers need to be experts in their application framework of choice. They need to be certified in their cloud provider and also need to understand container orchestration. That's hard. That's a lot of stuff. And at the end of the day, what do we want our developers focused on? Do we want them to be, in the nitty gritty of their cloud provider, or do we want them solving business problems for their customers? Because, I hate to say this, but our customers have never come to us and said, I need more Kubernetes. I need more GCP. They want features and functionality, and it's up to us to kind of wire that stuff together. So we need to understand the implications of this more democratized version of software development. And perhaps we also need to remember that this is like, be careful what you wish for. Like we're the dog that caught the car. So yes, we have more control and that's cool, but we also have more accountability. And so we need to remember Uncle Ben's wise words: with great power comes great responsibility. And so we need to understand, again, the ramifications for the fact that I have control of a lot of these things that I didn't have in the past. We need to make sure we're thinking about monitoring. This gets lost a lot in these environments, but you can't have these distributed applications without having good monitoring in place. And some organizations have gone all the way to sort of this monitor-driven development approach, which says, yeah, we're testing in prod because that's where our customers are testing the app right now. So what is your service doing? Do you know? And there's key components to monitoring. One is logging. What would you say your service is doing? Now, of course, many of us have flown in that scenario where logging is basically, everything is logged in like triplicate or nothing is logged at all. We need to have good dashboards in place, so give me an idea what the health is of my service. We need to have good alerting. Now, this is the kind of thing, alerts are interesting because they need to be actionable and they need to be something that a human being has to intervene on. If the system can fix itself, it doesn't need to be an alert. And then we need to have tracing in place. We need to have good context into all these spinning plates that make up these distributed systems. I can't just put a breakpoint in and walk my way through the code anymore. I might not even have access to some of the code. It might be, assigned to a completely different team, might be in a different country, might be a different organization, who knows? Now, we could spend an hour talking just about key metrics. We also need to consider, what's our sampling frequency look like? There's this desire in a lot of places to have more. And there's at a certain point, you can't distinguish between it. I remember this comes up a lot in audio. So back when iPods were kind of our dominant music listening device, and some musician had come out with or was signed to be the face of this new competitor, and I remember a lot about the device other than it was shaped like a Toblerone bar. But the big claim to fame was, the sampling frequency is so much higher, the sound's so much richer than what you get on an iPod. And people who actually understand how the human ear works said, no, you can't distinguish the difference. There's just no way the human ear can tell the difference between these two at all. So we have to be very careful with our sampling frequency. We need to understand dashboard design as well. What's a good dashboard for people to look at? We have to look at usability there. Going to be some pager duty as a part of that. Sorry. And the moral of the story is that it takes time to get this right. So don't be afraid to tweak, adjust, adapt, etc. And there's a ton of great tools here as well. Use whatever works. If you happen to be in my ecosystem, Spring Boot Actuator actually gives you a lot of this for free right out of the box. You get a lot of good data right there. The moral of the story in today's world is automation is just table stakes. This is just the kind of the bare minimum, and again, whether we like it or not, whether it's convenient or not, we keep getting expectations sort of, go up for us. And what we could get away with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, our customers just won't allow today. They won't accept that. Again, if your app is down for 48 hours for maintenance, it's a pretty good chance you're losing business because of that. So we can't compete without this automation in place. And a lot of that boils down to site reliability engineering. And I do think this is ultimately why we're seeing a lot of chatter about this. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept, please take a look at this book. You can get it online. It's also on O'Reilly's platform. You do not need to read this cover to cover. It's really a set of essays that are sort of, loosely grouped together thematically, but there's a lot of really good information in here, and, gives us a lot of insights from how things are done at Google. They run at a scale some of us will never see, quite frankly. And so a lot of really good information that will help us. And again, I think this is just sort of the bare minimum of what we need to do to be competitive in today's marketplace. All right, well, with that, I will pause and see if there are any questions. Stop the screen share, drag this over so I can look at y'all. Any questions, comments, theories, queries on any of that? Let's see, it sounds like you still have to argue about this. Do you have a favorite argument in favor of CI/CD? Reliability and repeatability, and ultimately this saves us money, saves us time, and if you want me to be able to move quickly and you want me to be responsive to the changes in the marketplace, then this is what I got to have. I need to be able to do this in order to get code to production. Again, the mantra for me is that reliably and repeatedly. It's not enough to do it once. We have to be able to do it countless times. So that's usually the argument I make, is this is ultimately saving us money. So that's a good question. Other comments, questions? You bet, my pleasure. Do you prefer implementing your own CI/CD or using a commercial platform? I'm not a big fan of rolling your own for anything. I've been a part of that. I'm old enough to have been on a project where we basically created our own version of JSPs before JSPs were fully a thing. And I understood why we did it. We had good reasons, but then we have to now maintain our own JSP implementation, which is non-trivial work. I just don't think that's something your customers want you to do. So there's a lot of good options out there. I don't feel like this is the kind of place where we should be rolling our own. The odds of you, you should be able to find something in the marketplace that will give you the features and functionality that you want and need. I would much rather do that. Even something that gives you 80% of what you want, I think, is still giving you more leverage than you having to write it and then maintain it. That's the other side effect. Another thing that kind of gets lost when you have these homegrown things, it's hard to hire for that. I think about this in terms of Spring, because I saw an instance where an organization more or less recreated Spring, and they were quite proud of that. And it's like, well, hang on a sec here. If you put out a job post for your internal framework, you're not going to find anybody that has experience with it, because you're the only ones that use it. Whereas you take a commercial thing or a widely used open source thing like Spring, well, guess what? There are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And, you have a much easier time finding people that are familiar with that technology. We decided to use a common framework, implement our own platform. They say none existing was doing what they wanted. So part of the other, I guess, force here is, and I'm going to steal this quote from Neil Ford, but meta work is more interesting than work. And so if I'm given the choice between, building or putting the proverbial web, front end on a relational database kind of a project, well, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. But building a framework for putting web front ends on a relational database, oh, now that's the project I can sink my teeth into. That's a lot more interesting than just solving this business problem. So that's the other competing force, is that in some organizations, we're going to run into that person, and sometimes they're really influential. They're in a decision-making role, and they just want to do the cool thing as opposed to, well, this is what my customers need. So building my own CI/CD pipeline is way cooler and more interesting, and I can put that on my resume. Although, to be fair, that should be a bit of a red flag to anybody seeing that resume. So why did you need to build your own? And sometimes we need to do that when things are in their infancy. But the problem is, you need to have a plan for when to get off of that, because eventually the tools, the open source projects catch up, and now this thing is an anchor for you. It's holding you back as opposed to giving you leverage. And it can be really hard in an organization where we've got a lot invested in our hand-rolled thing to know when it's time to, put that thing out to pasture and move over to a more generally accepted approach. So yeah, I think you're probably right that, I think your suspicion is well-founded. So other questions or comments here this evening? And I do appreciate the questions. This is what I love about this job, is getting to have that interaction. I wish I was in front of you in person. That would be more fun, but such is life. Maybe in 2022. All right, I see thumbs up. That's always makes me happy. Okay, well, I guess if there's no other questions, I'll just say thank you very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your evening. I'll be back again tomorrow and Thursday if my calendar is correct. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody.